A thriller, a love story, and a cautionary tale.
He tried so hard to be this superhuman being.
Her husband took on the outer reaches of the world while she waited at home.
I was very cool with it.
A world-class explorer, testing his own mortality.
It's better than anything I could have imagined.
Escaping disaster over and over again.
And he said, Jules, you know, there's been this accident.
But simmering beneath this white-knuckle life was a danger only she saw coming.
I had a really bad feeling about it.
I had no comprehension of the price that I might pay.
A step too far. Thanks for joining us. I'm Lester Holt. We all know of people who build big careers for themselves by putting the rest of their lives on hold. The man you're about to meet was willing to make enormous sacrifices in pursuit of his dreams. But there is someone else in our story, and she learned well before he did that some dreams carry too high a price. Here's Sarah James.
There is nothing typical about Pete and Julia Bland.
We've never done comfortable domestic. It's always been high octane. My life with Pete has ranged across the most enormous spectrum, from the very brightest of golds, shimmering summertime, complete and utter frivolity, to horror movie horrifying adventures that have gone completely wrong, head injuries, heart surgeries. It's been extreme.
Like most of us, they wanted to live life to the fullest and follow their dreams. But unlike many others, their dreams and challenges were so extraordinary, they were captured on a huge canvas, splashed across newspapers, detailed in a book, featured on television.
It's historic. It's fantastic. We're making history here. It's great.
To the public, Pete was the Iceman, Julia his stunning wife. Their story was driven by adrenaline-pumping adventure, big ambitions, and even bigger sacrifices, risks to life and love.
I had no comprehension of the price that I might pay one day for my actions.
Their journey together had a storybook beginning. They met as teenagers in southern Australia, where Pete was a farm kid. It was impossible not to notice Julia Knight, an effervescent city girl her friends called Jules.
Jules is just gorgeous, you know. She's just like that little league.
Felt like she was a step.
Just out of my league, you know, just out of my league. So, just, not much, but a little bit.
They became friends, danced together at parties. But then one day, Pete gathered his courage and asked her out on a date. Jules loved horses, so Pete wooed her with a ride through the mountains near his home, serenading her along the way.
That date was the beginning of a journey of travel, adventure, experiences, like a fantasy.
There was never any will I, won't I sort of go out with him. It was from that moment on, he was the one.
Jules was raised in a conventional home and was impressed by Pete's sense of adventure, his can-do spirit, his relentless determination. This is a man who does not take no for an answer.
Oh, no. No, he doesn't know the word no. He just has this incredible energy, just a great energy.
They were young, in love, and living a dream. They windsurfed in St. Lucia, motorbiked in Greece, sailed the Coral Sea.
Life was easy, you know, life was uncomplicated. It was university, it was a bit of work, it was saving up money to get on an aeroplane and go travel. It was very easy to be in love.
It all sounds like one big romantic vacation.
Pretty much was.
After college, Jules settled into a career in corporate public relations, but Pete had no interest in a 9-to-5 job. He earned some money moving racing yachts across the Atlantic, started a shortbread cookie company on the farm, traded commodities overseas. He was always looking for a way to make a living while exploring the world.
Jules admired the dreamer in Pete and wasn't at all surprised when he signed on for an expedition to the South Magnetic Pole. Little did she know he was about to volunteer to risk his life near the bottom of the Earth.
Of all the things Pete wanted to do in life, going to Antarctica was at the top of the list. One day, when he least expected it, he got his chance, when his best friend had to bow out of a spot on a yacht crew.
I said, man, I'm there. I'll be there tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. Bang, you know, done.
You couldn't wait.
There's no one in the world who's going to miss that opportunity to go to Antarctica.
Did Pete come and talk to you before he said yes?
Oh, no.
And you were supportive of this?
Yes, look, we had an understanding that neither of us would ever impinge on each other's wishes and dreams in that way.
And so, the very next day, Pete was off on a voyage he and his shipmates would never forget. For starters, conditions were terrible and only getting worse.
It was a pretty stormy trip, you know. We were doing like 19 knots, surfing down the face of these waves.
They were being tossed like a toy in high seas, fighting frigid temperatures that glazed the yacht in ice. And then, of course, there were the icebergs.
And you're on a 60-foot yacht with 10 lives on board and a quarter of an inch of aluminium between you and the iceberg the size of a small country.
It was difficult and expensive for Pete to call from the yacht, but Jules was used to periods apart and assumed no news was good news.
As far as I knew, the trip was going well.
In fact, it wasn't. In the scramble to dodge an iceberg, a rope had fallen overboard, wrapped around the propeller, and crippled the vessel. For 3 days, they drifted and bobbed, unable to free the rope.
Everyone said, that's it, we give up, we're going to turn around and go back.
Their destination was within sight, but Pete's shipmates wanted to turn around and limp back into warmer waters under sail power, skip the risky final few miles of the journey to Antarctic shores. But Pete had another idea.
I saw it as an opportunity
An opportunity for what?
to prove myself.
Prove himself to the patron of the trip. Pete hoped to earn a spot on the next expedition by rescuing this one. The catch? The only way to reach the propeller was to dive into the ocean, which was just 30 degrees. The ship's doctor said any more than 5 minutes in the frigid water could be deadly.
This was like Mission Impossible.
Yeah.
You had 5 minutes, do it or forget it.
Yeah.
Back at home in Australia, Jules had no idea what Pete was about to do and was shocked when she later learned the details.
There was no wetsuit on board. They'd been left off on the dock. So he was sort of in wet weather gear that was kind of taped up. I just thought, what an idiot. I really just thought, that's crazy.
Crazy because Jules knew something Pete's shipmates didn't, that Pete had a medical history which made the plunge especially risky for him. At the age of 8, Pete had open heart surgery to repair a hole in his heart. During his recovery, Pete says his father, a distinguished judge as well as a farmer, pushed him to do endless exercises, accepting no excuses, instilling the lesson that through hard work,
Anything can be gotten over if your dream is big enough.
Remember, we've got you attached to the deck, so you come up on those lines that you're going down on.
and so, tethered to the deck and wearing little more than rain gear, Pete took a deep breath and went in, a kitchen knife strapped to his wrist. Pete knew the immediate physical risk he was taking, but had no idea of the other, greater cost he might pay for his daring deed.
You can chuck Pete Bland in a hole and he'll get out of it every single time. It does beg the question, doesn't it? Why does he keep on putting himself in holes?
Coming up, a crazy plan takes a dangerous turn.
Even my little frozen mind knew that the strategy that I'd gone down with wasn't going to work.
BC.
Pete Bland and 9 shipmates had been tossed in high seas off Antarctica for 3 days when Pete volunteered for an icy plunge, a daring attempt to cut through thick rope tangled around the yacht's propeller. Back at home, Jules was stunned and troubled that Pete would volunteer for what seemed perilously close to a suicide mission.
Does he think he's Superman?
Yes.
There's nothing he can't do.
No.
But Pete had his eyes on the prize. If he succeeded, he'd earn a spot on an upcoming expedition to the North Magnetic Pole and a chance to make history as the first Australian to get to both poles. He knew he had just 5 minutes. Any longer in such frigid water could be deadly.
Off you go, son. Don't get tangled with the line. Don't go cutting the safety line off.
With the crew waiting anxiously on deck, Pete went under and started hacking at the rope.
And it wasn't coming free quickly. And even my little frozen mind knew that the strategy that I'd gone down with to cut this rope free wasn't going to work because it was too much rope.
Out of breath, Pete had no choice but to surface, then dive back down and try to uncoil the rope. He had been in the water more than 4.5 minutes.
I kind of just leaned back and I just let my hands do their job. And I just did that and I knew, phew. And so as the rope came off, I fell away and up I went. And I remember they just hauled me in, you know. I was done.
In you come. Get downstairs.
On the deck, Pete's crewmates knew Pete had passed the 5-minute mark. They rushed to warm his shivering body.
I was just throbbing my head.
When Jules heard how long he'd been in the icy water,
I mean, if it was life-threatening, you know, if somebody's life depended on it, that's something, you know. But, I mean, it sounds quite ridiculous that you would do that.
still, Pete had saved the trip and his chance to step on Antarctic soil. He returned home on top of the world and ready to take a different plunge.
He got down in one knee and asked me, and I actually said, "Are you serious?" Because I thought, I'm not telling you what my answer is unless I know you're serious, because then you're one step ahead of me and you know what my answer will be. And I, of course, said yes.
Life seemed perfect, but things were about to take a frightening turn. Pete was training hard for that payoff trip to the Arctic when he suddenly felt dizzy and sick. Jules rushed him to the doctor.
It was his aorta, which had blown up to the size of a football.
Pete had an aneurysm in the main artery carrying blood from his heart. If the aneurysm burst, it could kill him. He needed surgery, and soon.
I said, "Oh, Doc, oh, right, well, thank you for that. Can you do it tomorrow? Can you fix it tomorrow? Or can you leave it for 6 months?" And he said, "No, but why?" And I said, "Oh, sorry, Doc, I'm Pete Bland. And I'm going to be the first Australian to the North Magnetic Pole. I'd really appreciate it if you could knock that surgery over quick smart."
The man who didn't know the word no couldn't hear the bad news. Jules could.
The fellow said, "No, I don't think you're understanding what this means. This is a life-threatening situation. You might not walk again. You know, you need to reconsider your life."
But what seemed most troubling to Pete was when the surgeon told him he'd have to forget about his trip to the Arctic.
I cried and I cried. I'll never forget. And Jules knew why I was crying, why I was upset, why I was devastated, and it wasn't because of the surgery.
It was because of the dream.
It was because of the dream. She knew that I'd allowed my dream to be ripped out of me.
Doctors thought his condition was, at least in part, a result of Pete's icy plunge. It seemed Pete's quest for adventure was beginning to take a toll.
I didn't like the idea of this time bomb ticking away in his chest. I wanted it out. I wanted it fixed.
But surgery carried its own terrifying risks, paralysis, even death. Would this crisis be Pete's wake-up call to step back from a life on the edge? Coming up, hooked on adventure and the chance at making history, Pete heads for the Arctic.
Hello, JJ, it's your husband. I'm very well. I'm very cold. It's about -20.
So much for stepping back. when A Step Too Far continues. Pete and Jules Bland were young, in love, and scared to death. Pete had an aortic aneurysm which could kill him if it burst, but surgery could leave him paralyzed, even prove fatal. Incredibly, at just 28, Pete was undergoing open-heart surgery for the second time in his life.
Oh, I just thought it was just outrageous.
Jules remembers seeing him right after the operation. She'd never seen Pete so down.
He looked so pale and swollen. When he came to, he was, he was very much wanting to get down and make sure his feet were working.
I got myself in a position and I went, wiggle your toe, Pete, wiggle your toes. And I wiggled my toes and then wiggled.
While Pete wasn't paralyzed, there was a long way to go from being able to wiggle his toes to being able to trek to the North Pole. But that trip was a tantalizing lure.
It was the carrot dangling in front of him.
Jules was beyond relieved, happy to be taking him home. But instead of following doctor's orders to rest, Pete was soon training harder than ever.
And he was up and about and walking around the farm. I think one of our neighbours picked him up down the road and brought him home for me at one point. I mean, he was outrageous. He was a very bad patient. Very bad patient.
But he was a very exciting partner, and 8 months later, the pair tied the knot.
It was just a fabulous moment. We'd been through so much together and we were sort of cemented in this together. It was very emotional, it was in sickness and in health kind of thing.
Neither heart trouble nor marriage was going to slow Pete down. He was chomping at the bit to get to the Arctic, to reach his goal of becoming the first Australian to reach both poles. And this time it was for a cause. He'd turned this trip into a major fundraiser for the Australian Heart Foundation. Jules was thrilled to see Pete healthy and happy again. But it would mean another long stretch apart. He'd be away for 35 days this time.
Usually what I do is I say, right, you're off on your trip, and I shut you out and I do my life and then you come back.
Is that a risky move?
Definitely. But it's a necessary one. It's self-preservation, because otherwise you're worrying about this person and it's affecting your life.
If Jules shut Pete out too many times, would it one day be impossible to let him back in? This risk wasn't even on their radar. Pete was focused on the trek before him, 400 miles in sub-zero temperatures.
It's better than anything I could have imagined. It's just pristine and pure and raw.
Pete used the satellite phone to check in when he could.
Hello, JJ, it's your husband. I'm very well. I'm very cold. It's about -20.
But Jules' confidence faltered a bit when, for 5 days, there was no contact, not a word. Had something happened?
Come on, baby, do your thing. Do your thing. Everyone's crossing their fingers.
Jules didn't know that the satellite phone had frozen. The team not only was fine, but about to reach their goal. Pete had made history.
To the North Pole. I'm really proud, actually. Really, very proud.
And the media were anxious to tell his story of overcoming such great odds.
You had the biggest smile on your face.
Yeah, big smile.
He was a hero, People very much relate to him. They can relate to that spirit of adventure and wanting to overcome odds.
Pete returned home bursting with pride over all he'd accomplished and hoping he could turn his passion for adventure into a full-time career.
He'd had a sort of epiphany of how you can be a commercial adventurer, and that was something that he was going to work on, because he wasn't always going to just have a normal job.
It had always been a point of friction for Pete and his dad, who thought it was more than time for Pete to zero in on a stable, traditional career. But Pete seemed to have found the perfect compromise, a marketing job that gave him enough time off to try to make history again, this time with old friend and fellow adventurer Jay Watson.
Jay would come around and they'd sort of bring out all their maps and hide them out in the back room.
They're scheming and plotting.
Scheming and plotting. Scheming and plotting.
We love these adventures. We love being out there in the elements. We love being amongst the wilds. We wanted to be out there and amongst it.
But to get financial backing, their adventure needed to be dramatic and unprecedented. Pete and Jay hatched a plan to become the first team in the world ever to cross the Antarctic Peninsula unassisted. No sled dogs, no food drops. Pete had survived open-heart surgery twice and now was going to attempt one of the most arduous treks a human can make.
It's a pretty much, you know, James Bond 007. It's full on. You're skiing, you're kayaking, you're ice climbing, you're doing this world-first crossing of the Antarctic Peninsula. It's pretty special.
World First had become Pete's mantra. This time, he and Jay would film their historic trip for a television documentary. While she didn't object, Jules realized she now had a very different, far more conventional dream. It prompted her to offer her adrenaline junkie husband a most unorthodox deal, from whiteout conditions to a close shave when Pete fell through the ice, to having to crawl across stretches of snow to avoid being swallowed by a crevasse. But they were beating every obstacle thrown at them, at least so far.
I gotta say, this is one of the most beautiful things, apart from my darling wife, that I have ever seen.
Were you in any sort of contact with Pete and Jay?
No, not at all.
Each was in his own world. Back at home, Jules had her hands full between the new baby and running the farm.
What were you juggling?
Cattle that wouldn't move from one paddock to another without sort of forcing on horseback, and we had shearing as well.
She took breaks to nurse Olivia, but there was little time to sleep. Pete was counting the days until his family reunion, but he was also jubilant that he and Jay had put those early setbacks and jittery nerves behind them and were halfway to their goal. Being unassisted wasn't easy.
Wouldn't say no to a bit of support, right?
Exactly. We need the dogs now.
Dogs in a helicopter.
After skiing and kayaking for 19 days, Pete wrote in his diary,
I am really looking forward to seeing Jules and Olivia. I am missing them a lot.
Pete never questioned that Jules would be there for him at the end of an adventure. She always had been. But this time, the miles between them were nothing compared to the growing emotional distance. But the end was literally in sight. All that lay between Pete, Jay, and mission accomplished was an easy 8-mile ski down to the yacht waiting to take them home. Pete would never get there. Jules was in the shower when the phone rang. It was the captain of the yacht.
He said, Jules, there's been this accident. It's that sinking in your stomach, and it's that heart racing panic. And I just thought, what on earth am I going to tell his mum?
Coming up, Pete is missing, and the clues indicate disaster.
All I could see down the slope was a glove, his glove in the snow.
Pete and Jules' lives were turned inside out in one big flash of white. The horrible news came in an early morning phone call to the farm.
I had a bad feeling. I had a really bad feeling about it.
Pete was just half a day away from completing a historic crossing of the Antarctic Peninsula with his best friend, Jay Watson. Just a day away from heading home to Jules and their young daughter. But the weather had turned ugly, and so the men decided to hunker down for the night, wait out the storm.
The tent was getting battered. We were getting battered.
That's when Pete stepped outside to grab supplies.
And he sort of yelled out to me, look, I'm just going to go get some supplies out of the kayak.
Then nothing.
The uncertainty of where Pete was after about 5 minutes. I was like, this can't be right. You know, where is he? So I yelled out a few times.
No response. Jay poked his head outside the tent, saw nothing but white, and then a glove.
All I could see down the slope was a glove, his glove in the snow, and this big scar where the actual avalanche had come down the slope. So that's when I knew he'd actually been taken by the avalanche.
The fierce wind had masked the massive rumble of an avalanche, which had swept away his best friend.
I thought, how is this going to play out? You know, Pete's got a family, a wife. You know, I was half responsible for this whole expedition, this whole trip.
I didn't think it was going to work out well. I just thought, you know, this just doesn't bode well for him and for us.
Her only comfort that Pete was with Jay, his best friend, and someone Jules trusted. But Jay had no idea if Pete was even alive.
I knew if he'd gone down the mountain, he would have gone off this cliff edge into a crevasse.
Jay scrambled to the edge of the crevasse, peered over, and his heart sank.
I could see him down the base. He was on his back. He was looking like he was trying to move, but he just couldn't.
Back home, Jules was getting bits and pieces of information, her imagination filling in the blanks.
I don't know if they mentioned that there was an avalanche. Either way, I knew that he was in terrible, terrible strife.
She had no idea Pete had made a 14-story free fall onto solid ice and lay sprawled like a broken doll. Had he broken his back? Jay made the dangerous descent to Pete's side, tried to talk to him. What did you say to him?
I obviously went straight to him and started chatting, and I just knew straight away that I wasn't getting any responses whatsoever. It was just a distant look in his eyes. There was no registry of me or the situation or where we were. It was just nothing.
Pete was bleeding from the ears, nose, and mouth. Jay didn't know whether Pete would even survive the night. As for the pledge they had made, that if one were unable to continue, the other would go it alone.
You might think that way, but it's in practice it's not quite that easy.
Back in Australia, Pete's national fame meant his family's private drama had become a very public spectacle.
For the young Australian adventurer, Peter Bland, a trek across the frozen Antarctic wasteland was to be the experience of a lifetime.
News crews descended on the farm. Jules hid her fear and spoke.
It's the sort of thing that Pete loves to do, and that's the man that I married, and that's to be expected, and I've always embraced what he's done and encouraged it. So I think I might have to rethink that strategy.
Back in the crevasse, Jay placed a tent over his unconscious friend, tried to keep him warm. He contemplated carrying Pete out, but feared he might injure him further. Yet staying in the crevasse meant another avalanche could bury them both.
Certainly something I tried to shut out. I mean, I knew what was down there. I knew it was a really ugly spot down there.
The captain of the yacht radioed for help, but couldn't get any quickly.
I've just been talking to the helicopter pilot. He says it's impossible to land there. It is just not possible to land. It is far too dangerous.
Jay stayed by his friend's side for 3 long days, melting icicles to give Pete sips of water. His buoyant buddy now helpless as a baby. Meanwhile, information was trickling in to Jules.
They're trying to get him out. We're trying to get a chopper in. The weather's really bad. And he's unconscious, but he's alive.
A team from the yacht made the torturous climb up to the crevasse. Using a door from the boat as a stretcher, they hoisted Pete out of the crevasse, then dragged him to a spot where a helicopter could safely land. Pete was flown to a hospital in Antarctica, while Jay set off to finish the journey the pair had begun so optimistically. And Jules, who hadn't slept in days, scrambled to get the first flight she could to South America, where they'd take Pete as soon as he could be moved.
I didn't know which end was up. I just knew I had to get on that plane and through those doors.
Pete's femur had been forced out of his hip socket. He had multiple broken ribs. But those weren't the worst injuries of all. Jules knew Pete had also fractured his skull. How bad was the injury to his brain? Would he and they ever be the same?
He looked like a stranger. You know, he had a beard and he was scrawny and he was battered and he recognised me. He didn't know Olivia's name. I just thought, this guy is a wreck. He's a train wreck.
Coming up, Jules reaches her limit, and most heartbreaking of all, didn't realize how jumbled his mind was. He wrote in his diary,
I had to be where everywhere. Just have crossed date day.
Pete and Jules had overcome so much in their life together, but they'd never faced an uphill climb like this before.
Jules brought Pete back home to the farm and once again tried to nurse him back to health. She was relieved that his injuries were no longer life-threatening, but deeply worried about the brain damage. Her husband was simply no longer himself. Would he ever be?
It's all you can do to sort of buy the groceries and cook some dinner and you know, and get through the day in that situation.
Jules worried Pete's judgment was impaired. They both knew his memory was affected. He took time off from work. His obsession now was relearning the names of people he'd known for years and memorizing numbers, drilling himself even harder than his father had when he'd forced Pete to do those detested exercises as a boy.
It's very disturbing to have your husband want to spend dinner with you wanting to memorise your credit card number.
This was not the Peter Bland who had left.
This is a whole new scenario.
Just third epiphany which brought forgiveness.
Dear Dad, you were a great dad. You were inspirational, brave, determined and generous.
As his father had since died, Pete poured his realization out on a paper napkin.
I never thanked you for making me do my exercises. I only blamed you. You were a great dad. I miss you every conscious moment.
Pete realized he no longer had to be best or first, was content just being Pete, no longer had to be Superman. But his realization came too late to save the relationship he treasured most, his marriage.
I have never been into a crevasse as deep as this. I've never been on a journey as long as this. I've never taken on anything that's drawn upon my strength and resources anywhere near this.
Pete's adventures had cost his family dearly, both financially and emotionally.
To be honest, Pete's come first a lot. He's had to come first medically, and then the children come first as well. So you get kind of lost in the wash. It's this frustration that you need to, that you are a person as well, and what happens to you? You know, where do you go?
Earlier this year, Jules asked Pete for a separation and moved off the Bland family farm. The kids divide their time between the two. Over the 8 years since Pete's accident, Jules found a way to deal with her frustration and uncertainty.
Is this the place where you just let it all out?
This is the place. This is a padded cell.
With Pete's help, Jules converted this barn into an art studio. What began as a kind of self-prescribed therapy turned into a career. And last December, Jules had her first gallery exhibition.
Peter Bland, who hung this whole room yesterday and worked like a demon, and couldn't have done it without you on so many levels. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart.
Where does the Peter and Julia Bland saga end?
I'm not exactly sure, but I have a great feeling about it. So I think that if we put fear aside and fear of how things might turn out and trust, I think that it'll all work out how it's supposed to.
Jules says she's determined to follow her path even as Pete follows his. Pete regularly ventures to Antarctica, but rather than attempt risky world firsts, he leads groups of business professionals, teaching them the difficult life lessons he has learned here on the continent that cost him so much.
I remain the adventurer. I'm Pete Bland and I'm an adventurer with a message. Test the boundaries, go beyond the comfort zone that might be holding you back and seek the goal beyond. But make sure you take full due diligence on the price that might be spent upon others who love you dearly.
To learn more about Jules and Peter Bland, visit our website at dateline.msnbc.com. That's all for now. I'm Lester Holt. For all of us at NBC News, thanks for joining us.